really ties into what you were saying before about the belief now is not if there's going to be a kinetic confrontation with China, but when. And there's a lot of focus on China's Indo-Pacific strategy as far as the South China Sea or Taiwan. But from everything you're mentioning with the ports, the alliances with other authoritarian regimes like Iran and Russia, active in Latin America, as well as the space factor with this, it seems like a war won't be fought far away. It will be fought on America's doorstep.
No, absolutely. I think that's the big kind of takeaway. And I've made this argument for about 10 years because, if we go 10 years ago, most people in Latin America believed that China was simply an economic partner. They thought this talk about China's military dimensions or its preparation for warfare, they thought that was too alarmist. That's a mischaracterization of the transformation that China's took over the years, opening markets and things like that. But those that were astute observers of China, people that I talked to, I'm not an expert on China, but people that I know that were telling me a lot of that is just window dressing. I mean, we saw this with Russia, right? They did privatization, but they didn't change the rule of law, and then once they broke, once they broke their agreements with Hong Kong in 2017, it kind of showed that they're no longer all things off the table. And when they signed that national security law, that was really an indicator that China is no longer going to respect any international norms or treaties, and they're going to move on the entire world. And I argued with many of our Latin American friends and counterparts that these so-called economic investments in their country are going to suck them into a global conflict, a conflict that they don't want to be a part of, but they're going to be a part of, because Latin America wasn't a heavy actor in World War I and World War II. It was mostly fought in the European area of operation. But as you mentioned, I think this time Latin America is going to be a major theater of operation for a conflict because of China, because China has brought Latin America into that conflict. And then the last part of that is to say that, China had this big bonanza, right? This big economic boom with the commodities pricing and the commodity super cycle. So Latin America and China capitalized on that in the sense that they, all the raw materials that are in Latin America, the minerals, the metals, and the oil and everything, it all ended up getting sent to China because they capitalized on that moment. But that's not the case. There is no commodity super cycle. China's economy is suppressing. They have a housing crisis. They have a banking crisis. They're not going to be able to, Xi Jinping's not going to be able to come like Hu Jintao and say $100 billion in the next 5 years. That's not going to happen. But what I would caution my Latin American friends is to say that China, that whole time that they were building this economic relationship with Latin America, it wasn't even to help China's economy. It wasn't just to feed their growing GDP. It was actually meant to help their defense industry, because as China's economy suppresses, their defense industry grows, that military civil fusion strategy that you're discussing, and those critical rare earth metals and minerals, and specifically lithium, is not because of China's economy, it's because of China's defense industry needs that. They need that to be able to empower their AI. They need to be able to power their fifth generation warfare, or as Shang Xiao calls their intelligent warfare. And so Latin America has become critical for their war plans. But most Latin Americans think this is just an economic endeavor by China. And that's, I think, proven to be wrong.
I mean, what about the space program? Because you mentioned that there's these two satellite bases, right? You've got one in Venezuela, which is presumably near the equator. And then you've got one in like a remote part of Argentina, which is essentially on the opposite side of the planet from Beijing, right? So you've got so there's space advantages there, and World War III or whatever war comes with China potentially is going to be largely, or at least partially, fought in space. What do these space observatories that are actually run by the PLA, what role are they potentially going to play?
No, that's huge. I mean, yeah, so they actually have 11 in South America.
Oh, 11. Okay, that's great. Wonderful.
Yeah, I mentioned this, this the largest space infrastructure in the world for China is in Latin America. And I think that's a big tell of how prioritized Latin America is in their grand strategy and their geopolitical ambitions. Actually, Argentina has 3. The one further south in Neuquén is the only deep space station that they have. The other 2 are more for local. But nonetheless, Let me give you a story about this because I think it'll kind of really encapsulate what I was talking about before about how they tricked Latin America. And in some cases tricked, in some cases had a willful autocratic partner. But in this is a little bit of both because the deals for that space station were negotiated under a previous president, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, who was aligned with Chavez and all the socialist bloc of Latin America. So I don't think she was tricked. I think she was corrupt and she probably got paid and she made this deal. But what's interesting, when the government changed hands in 2015, Cristina Fernandez Kirchner went away, became a senator, and the new president, Mauricio Macri, came in, much more pro-U.S., much more economic, free market-oriented businessman, wanted to look at the space station. There was a lot of debate about it within the Argentine Congress because they tried to ratify the station through the Argentine Congress to make it permanent. And they actually did that. They were successful in that. And they gave it a 50-year concession with a 15-year renewal. So it's for 100 years going to be there, according to the Argentine law. But they wanted to renegotiate the deal to be able to add more transparency because as it stands today, the Argentinians can't even visit the space station without making an appointment. So it's really silly. It's on their sovereign territory and they can't do anything about it. It's literally like another embassy. So they wanted to renegotiate it. So they sent their foreign minister to Beijing to essentially find mechanisms to increase the transparency on the station, not to take it away, not to shut it down, just create it. I think they wanted to have a board, like a transparency board, so that they could look at the equipment that's being shipped in and out. And China very diplomatically said, yes, Mr. President Macri, we'd love to do this. Whatever you need, we're happy to help. But please look at your contract. That was the thing that they said before the foreign minister departed. And when they looked closely at the contract of the space station, what they found was something that was in all the contracts that China had signed in Argentina, which is called the cross default clause, meaning that if you renegotiate one project, Chinese project in Argentina, you have to renegotiate all your projects. That means they can accelerate the interest on the loan payments, the time on the loans. They can basically screw you economically if you try to negotiate something like a space station. So the Macri government in Argentina figured out they're really, they got hoodwinked. They're really stuck with the space station, that they have little oversight, little control, and little transparency of what's really going on there. And that remains to this day. So it's a good understanding of how China operates. They call it economic coercion, but it really has tricked some of these governments. And it tricked maybe the country of Argentina, but it was done because the former president of Argentina probably was in on it.
Wow, that is very predatory.
That's the art of the deal. Wow.
Yeah. And they've done this in many countries. So in other countries, and what I've told to our friends in Latin America, I have a lot of conversations with our more friendly governments, democratic allies. And I tell them, there's this kind of, I think, false thinking that was imposed on a lot of these countries. China's also invested in a lot of soft power things. They have their Confucius Institutes, but it's more than that. They have think tanks and university professors and media to be able to draw this echo chamber drive this one fundamental narrative talking point, that Latin America needs China, that the future of Latin America is with China. That's the kind of psychological message that they've been trying to implant in the region, and it's worked. And many foreign ministries have talked about, they look at the future, with China and the Pacific strategy. They actually created a democratic alliance called the Pacific Alliance, which was actually focused on trade with Asia, but that didn't exclude China. It was trade with Japan, trade with Korea, trade with Australia, but also with China. And in that, what I tried to help was reverse that psychological damage that they've done. And I said, Latin America never needed China before the 21st century, doesn't need China today. Latin America doesn't need China. China needs Latin America. China needs Latin America to complete its global ambition, to complete its warfare strategy. But the key to that is that in every single country in Latin America that China's been able to penetrate, you need to find that one element that's critical for their strategy. In the case of Argentina, it's this space station. In the case of Peru, it could be that port. In the case of Ecuador, it's the Galapagos Islands. But once you, as a sovereign country in Latin America, figure out what China really wants from my territory, you now have negotiating power and leverage to use against it. And Ecuador actually used it. Ecuador is the only country in Latin America to actually successfully renegotiate its debt with China. And they did it by finding out that the Galapagos Islands was really all China really cared about, not the hydropower, not the electric, not the oil deals. They really cared about that Galapagos Islands. Why? Because that's the closest point in the Pacific to be able to encroach before you get into the Western Hemisphere.
Oh, I thought it was because they wanted to, do research into evolutionary biology.
That could be part of it as well. Very much so. But no, this is and it's key for Latin Americans to realize this because they have to be able to gain leverage. In the United States, obviously, if we were in the game, we would actually be able to capitalize on that leverage to push China out of Latin America.
Yeah. So I mean, you mentioned that like what the U.S. Should be in the game. So how specifically can the U.S. and maybe other democratic countries, like what can we do now to start to roll back some of this Chinese influence, push back on it, and prevent the further spread of authoritarianism there?
Yeah, so it's difficult currently because of the current administration. The Biden administration has been not everything they've done in Latin America has really just helped the authoritarians in the region. They've gone on this anti-corruption jihad. I mean, nobody's a fan of corruption, but a quite small-scale corruption of basically appointing a minister because you got some bribe, to large-scale corruption to where you've been indicted on over $1 billion of public work projects, like the case of the vice president of Argentina, and to conflate those together is silly, and it really just doesn't actually help advance any of our interests in the region. So it's a little bit difficult in that sense, but I think the power of the United States goes beyond Washington. It goes beyond our government. And I think we have to focus both on cultural connections. We have a cultural affinity with Latin America beyond any other region in the world. Language, history, demographics. The United States is the third largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. By 2030, I think the Hispanics, U.S. Hispanics, will be the largest minority in the region, in the United States. And I think we had to capitalize on this. China has none of that. China, there aren't. There are Chinese diasporas in Latin America, but they don't outweigh the U.S. Latin American connection. And so I think we have to start using that to our advantage. And then the second part is I think we have to start prioritizing Latin America. We have strategies for many parts of the world, the Middle East, even the Indo-Pacific, but we don't have a strategy for Latin America. We haven't thought about the region in a strategic mindset. And I think we need to do that. Actually, I'm part of an effort. As I mentioned, I direct a think tank here in Washington called Center for Secure Free Society. We're really a research think tank. So we have a bunch of research. That's how we get a lot of this knowledge about the actions of China. And we also look at Russia and Iran and the region. But I'm also a visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation. And part of my role with the Heritage Foundation is to work on this project 2025. And so we've taken upon ourselves to actually create a strategy for Latin America that's a renewed Monroe Doctrine. It's going back to the Monroe Doctrine, which was looking at the European monarchies at the time and saying you're off limits when you come into the neighborhood that we share in the Western Hemisphere. Well, we need to go back to that because China, in all of its ambitions, will not accomplish any of those ambitions against the United States if it doesn't capture Latin America. You can argue that it's captured a good part of Latin America, but we're on the 6th, 7th inning. It's not that game. We're not at the end game yet. So we need to act fast. We need to act fierce. And we need to go back into Latin America and reinforce a new vision for like a new renewed Monroe Doctrine of the sort. So we have some details on how we want to accomplish that, but it begins by just prioritizing the region.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today. This was an absolutely fascinating interview. If somebody watching wanted to follow you or learn more about the Center for a Secure Free Society, where should they go?
Yeah, so you can go to our website, securefreesociety.org. I also recommend everyone go to our YouTube channel because we're doing a lot of videos. We also have a podcast as well called Border Wars. We use the word border wars, but it's not just about the U.S. southern border. We talk about sovereignty issues worldwide. We talk about geopolitical issues. We talk a lot about China, Iran, and Russia, and Latin America. And also I'm a visiting fellow Heritage Foundation. So you could go to Heritage Foundation's website. It's the Allison Center for Foreign Policy. So I do a lot of my writing with them. So I've written about some of these issues through the Heritage Foundation. So either there or Secure Free Society, we have a plethora of work. We actually have something that we paused this year just because we're transforming it. It's called the VRIC Monitor. It's VRIC, which is Venezuela, Russia, Iran, and China. So it's an open source monitor that looks at these activities from these external actors in Latin America. We were doing it more in a report format, but we're now in the process of adapting it to be a kind of a virtual map, essentially. So we'll let you guys know as soon as it's online, hopefully early in 2024, so that your readers, your listeners, your watchers can all look at what China's doing in real time, so they can see some of these activities the way we see it. So we do this internally, but we wanted to make this available to the public as well.